that should be coming up?
No, that's it. It's great. It's working.
It's working?
Yeah.
Okay. It's hard to. That should be coming up?
No, that's it. That's.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? Wonderful.
I came here because of two exactly. Yeah, and
I hope that's an accurate description.
no, yeah, well,
I hope it will be.
yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you. Please introduce yourself to Jacob and Tuomo.
While you're waiting, they do the same thing. Same thing. Hallo. Hallo, Jakob. Ich bin Sebastian. Hallo. Hier in Deutschland. Hier, ja. Also,
I know.
Uber, HUBR. It's harder to spell. It's neither there. The Sebastian. So if I may, so we put it here. It's junior research group. Funded by so yeah, basically the Institute of Philosophy, but it's we this would be easy because civil system so like
Yeah, I just wonder if there's a way to make this.
Although usually
What are you trying to do, Professor?
What's the original ratio?
Yeah, and then yeah, Garcia is there.
Mirror my video just below light. All right, how's it looking? It's true, the light is. The light is ugly.
It's okay. I mean, do you ever look good on Zoom? Oh, it's okay. We're a bit pale, but it's fine.
Maybe we skip this thing.
I don't think. I think it is good to have this. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe we should.
It's possible that then you could find out.
That's what I thought. There we go. Not more.
So sorry, I thought to take it.
You want to see?
Test. It's not.
That's
Ask Martin. He wanted to look at.
I just put a little less light.
Yeah.
The light is also coming from your direction, Bernard. I think is part of it too. It's like.
All right. Well,
This is quite so I was here too early and yes.
I tried to dim the light. Tell me what you think. Have a seat.
Well,
Yeah.
I look like an old vampire now. No, that's a joke. No, we look fine. So come on, Zoom is around for a couple of years now. So why didn't they improve on that? Everything they show looks better than in real life.
Chris and Bruce.
Yeah.
You go ahead and find a chair.
Genau, das muss es sein. Das ist die Situation. Wie? Ja.
So anders ist. Okay. Yeah, actually, I had no idea how this would.
Yeah, they never thought this would be masses of people.
No, this I didn't. I mean, I was aware that it's only like a limited number, but I wasn't aware that it's. But I think they change rooms or something.
Yeah, it's also cold and snowy. I think that's why people, and then you have the option of zooming in.
Yeah, but I don't even know whether people understood that there was the option. And I then understood that Bernard as well as Martin had invited people or had spoken to people, and then I mean, just occurred
me. Email to Utopia, it says you could zoom in basically.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and only this morning I realized that there might. I mean, there is some kind of audience. Then I thought about you when you said, yeah.
So if they want to ask a question, we should get up and stand by the desk so they can hear us. Okay. Because the camera can turn around.
And Martin is not happy with the Zoom. Actually, he thinks we don't look good enough.
Well, you can just might be the event that in real life you look better than on Zoom. Everyone keeps in mind.
Yeah, but actually, this might also be somehow distorted. Is this really me?
Who's offered this? Is this actually Martin's?
No. I think it is part of the library, but then probably not the main reading room or something. I have no idea. I haven't been.
And have you followed all the other Utopia 1013 events as well?
No, it's the first time I hear about it. It's Columbia thing, right?
Yeah.
Well, he's also being streamed or
yeah,
okay.
And
you live in Berlin?
I live in Berlin.
But you do a PhD at Columbia?
No, I do a PhD in Frankfurt, Goethe University at Frankfurt. But I did my LLM at Columbia University, and that's where I'm at. I just saw it today in the morning.
Okay. And with whom in Frankfurt?
So I'm a lawyer, so with Anna-Katharina Mangold.
Ah, that's you. No, you're writing with Anna-Katharina Mangold. Okay.
Yeah, this might be different on Panda's side. Because what we see here might not be the.
What they see?
This might be the.
Okay, well.
Ah, I see.
And I hope she gets the other picture.
But usually they do. I mean, usually they. No, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm here at the trial.
Use my PhD Bernard.
I think he.
That's not this range was the actual thing. So you really have to be
No, I don't. A little framing.
Yeah, I have a PhD in philosophy, but I come up in media and then. And it's actually that we arrived and I picked it up on Facebook. And sounds interesting to be in Berlin and so that is well, yeah, that it should be.
Yeah, I had to work. I didn't have the time to do the readings. I was like, oh, no worries. They're gonna be like people. I said in the last year, oh yeah. Here we are.
Thing will be well dependent online.
Yeah.
I have us almost, it's like 1 minute to 4. Are we gonna start punctually?
We should
Might
go
as
Germans.
well.
We're Germans. We started.
Okay.
We just lost one guy, so.
Okay.
It's very difficult to be late at this event because then you have to open that door and walk through the
Yeah.
It's pretty embarrassing.
Yes.
So,
Is there anybody where we know we are missing?
one.
Sebastian?
There's one.
No.
Yeah, there it is.
Duncan? No?
It's even true. So.
So let's make. Okay.
Maybe get some name.
Yes.
Ist vielleicht einer noch in eure Runde kommt.
Das ist nicht so jemand.
Geht doch hier.
Die anderen müssen wir den Aufsatz natürlich genau, das muss ich jetzt irgendwie hier. Das ist jetzt doch weniger wir haben gedacht, das sei richtig eine Bibliothek und mehr Plätzen, aber das ist nicht so. Jetzt ist es improvisiert.
Yeah.
Okay, there's an extra chair. You can see. And that's it?
Yeah.
No, sit on the side. All right. We are ready? Everyone ready?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you ready? Yeah. Okay. All right. So, welcome to Utopia 1013. Welcome to Rahel Yegi and Martin Saar. And welcome to Berlin. Thank you all for being here. So, we're going to be discussing today the relationship to the concept of utopia within the first generation of the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer and Adorno, and later Marcuse, and adjacent thinkers such as Ernst Bloch, Walter Benjamin, and perhaps still further away, Karl Meinheim a bit. So I could not think of better interlocutors than Rahel and Martin, two of the leading critical thinkers on and of the Frankfurt School. I'll introduce you both in a moment, although everyone already knows you well. But let me first frame the seminar for the audience. So our seminar, Utopia 1313 this year, is focusing on what I'm calling concrete utopias with a gesture to Ernst Bloch and Etienne Balibar and others, but using the term slightly differently. The idea that we're proposing in this seminar of concrete utopias is of actually existing political initiatives, projects, and experiments that have been realized and that can prefigure a utopian future. The idea of concrete utopias is not the ultimate ambition or utopia that is envisioned, but actually those concrete manifestations of projects that are going on today, that have been realized, and that appear successful, such as, for instance, Cooperation Jackson, or certain forms of union organizing, or certain forms of federations of worker cooperatives, or eco-cooperatives like Longomai that have been operating since the 1970s. All actual experiments and initiatives that show the possibility of transformation. Now, the notion, of course, is different than Ernst Bloch's distinction between abstract and concrete utopias. Abstract as being more the wishes and dreams, and concrete being more alternatives, praxis alternatives, real kind of engaged praxis alternatives given a historical constellation. The term, as we're deploying it, is in a sense a little bit more concrete, actually, insofar as it is realized today. And it might conflict in some ways with the way Ernst Bloch was using the term, perhaps because we have different philosophies of history, say, or the philosophy of history has changed since then. Also because, at least in the debate we read, that was edited by Jonathan Rossler, who's here with us, there was this objection by Bloch to the idea of relaxing the notion of utopia, or thinking of it in terms of installments as already achieved, as he said. So there may be some distinctions, and part of the question of this seminar is to figure out how a contemporary notion of concrete utopias could relate in various ways to the Frankfurt School and adjacent thinkers. Now, of course, that's a very complicated question in itself because of the changes, even within the first generation of the Frankfurt School, the important shifts in the way that utopia was analyzed, particularly from an earlier moment in the 1920s and 30s, I would say, when there was more of a unidirectional thinking about utopia, unidirectional in the sense that it was predominantly thinking about within a historical context in the West, how the concept of utopia could or could not demobilize or help with the transformation of society. Again, in the earlier period. In a later period, I think it's more bi-directional in the sense that there's thinking about utopia both in the context of the West and the context of the East. And of course, in our readings, in the interview, and in the conversation between Adorno and Bloch, you hear very well this idea that we need to think about also the way in which utopia would be useful at that time, 64, right, within the Eastern Bloc, because of a stultified form of socialism. And that was a very important theme. So there's a transformation of the way people were thinking about utopia, even within the first generation. And those are some of the issues that we're going to be focusing on today. One could almost set out different positions at different times, having to do both with the internal thinking about the role of history or the historical timing, as it were, and then the transformation over time. And so hopefully we'll get into those questions. But yes, as I was saying, in both periods, it feels as if the concept of utopia is very instrumentalized and plays a particular role in relationship to a historical understanding of the times. So I can't think of two better critical philosophers to think about this with us and help explore and disarticulate the relation between critical theory and utopia. So Rahel Yagi will start first, and as you know, she's the author of Critique of Forms of Life, and is a professor of practical philosophy with an emphasis on social and political philosophy here at Humboldt University in Berlin, and director of the Center for Humanities and Social Change. And then after Rahel has presented some first thoughts. We'll turn to Martin Zarr, who, as you know, is the author of Genealogy as Critique, History and Theory of the Subject After Nietzsche and Foucault, and is professor here, in Frankfurt of social philosophy at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. And this year, though, is a fellow here at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. And in that capacity is actually our host this evening at the Wissenschaft. And so I want to thank you, Martin, and the Wissenschaft for hosting us this evening. And I want to welcome everyone to Utopia 1013. Rahel, do you want to kick us off with some thoughts?
I think I might. Just bring in some like introductory and some theses that I was thinking about. So yes, I actually have 5 or even 6 theses about the relation between critical theory and utopia, and I think I might just we might then just discuss those theses before I go deeper into detail. So the first thesis is that, it's obvious that historically critical theory has had an ambivalent position towards utopia. I think Jonathan Rössler has worked this out very, beautiful in one of his articles. And my first thesis is that we should stick to this ambivalence, but we have to make it productive, that we somehow have to keep the tension between utopian and anti-utopian thinking and try to get something out of it. I think that this ambivalence towards utopia does not prevent critical theory from being like revolutionary or aiming at practical or radical transformations. So it doesn't prevent it from relating to the kind of projects for radical transformation, and also those kind of existing political and social projects, or it should not prevent us from doing this, but at the same time, it gives us a certain perspective from which also to be, let's say, to reflect on the limits and the possibilities of such projects. So this means that we need to have a closer look at what it is, the reasons for being either anti-utopian or utopian, or lending to utopian thinking. And I think a lot of it is, obvious and very clear that critical theory, on the one hand, is decidedly anti-utopian, is due to its, roots in Marxism, and Marx, who started his project and his career by, criticizing utopian socialism. So this is one of the this still informs critical theory, I would say, and rightfully so. So there is something wrong about the idea of utopian thinking as a kind of thinking, and utopian projects as a kind of the kind of projects that think of themselves as, or that we think of as being like sketched on the drawing table, like something completely new that is unrelated to what we have now, that we could also like design on a drawing table. So there's something right about the anti-utopian critique. I think it has an epistemological dimension as well as a normative dimension. So the idea is that it is not so easy to even get beyond the existing paradigm. So this means that epistemologically speaking, we are stuck. This is something that Adorno reflects a lot upon. We are like stuck in the given and not able to get rid of the marks of like the given reality if we want to be utopian. But it has also a practical and a normative dimension, since it is a question of being authoritarian as well. So the idea is that it is only in the process of a radical transformation, in the process of revolution, that like the revolutionary class will determine how the future society should look like. So these are both, and I think, very good reasons for being anti-utopian. So critical theory is not anti-utopian in the sense of let's not go too far, or let's stay realistic. And this is something that might be a bit confusing in Marcuse's text when he talks about utopia as some, I mean, in terms of is it feasible or not, and then, I mean, actually, utopia is the moment when utopia withers away. So, but in this sense, of course, it's not, it is not anti-utopian. And I also think that the interesting move from Marx to critical theory is that one dimension in Marx that is, he is anti-utopian because, I mean, in terms of the difference between science and utopia. This is something that critical theory does not buy into. So this a dimension of Marx thinking that then in Marx orthodoxy has fallen into this kind of empiricist or positivist trap. That's not present, and that's not part of the anti-utopianism of critical theory, I think. So still, critical theory, of course, this is my third thesis, of course, is an utopian project in that it aims at a fundamentally different world. So a different world is possible. This, of course, is still the slogan of critical theory. It's still a project for radical transformation, or as Horkheimer says it in one of his early lectures, it does not aim at this or that problem within the existing social order, but at its fundamental transformation. So in this sense, of course, it is still utopian. It's still utopian in terms of thematizing, criticizing, wanting to change and transform the very framework in which we understand ourselves, the very framework that this social structure in which we live provides us with, and so on. So in this way, of course, it is utopian, meaning that to get beyond an existing framework actually means that, I mean, we don't know yet what the new would look like. So the critical theory idea about how this, and this is my fourth remark, how this paradigm change, how we can bring about the paradigm change, or how the new paradigm comes into being. The critical theory answer to this is determinate negation in Hegelian terms. I mean, the idea that we work through the contradictions of an existing social order in order to, that at the same time already brings about elements of the new. So this is the very, I mean, one of the most important thoughts, I think, in Marx, the idea that there is something that is somehow prefigured in the existing society, and the new then is actually not like the totally new, but something that is at the same time continuous. And I mean, there's like continuity and discontinuity, and discontinuity in continuity. So the idea, and this is also something that Marcuse discusses, is this like, a radical break. And then, I mean, in this interview, he says, no, I haven't been talking about an actual break, because, I mean, Marcuse himself is still very deep into the Marxian idea that there's the productive forces are the ones who, bring it about, develop something, develop the kind of possibilities and potentials that will, in the end, not only, create the kind of tension, the kind of contradiction and conflict that will lead to transformation. So the idea here is that those are potentials that are inherent in the existing society already, but not in the sense that we should look for like positive potentials, but in the sense of looking at the contradictions, looking at what could be possible. And that's the thing that is very important for Adorno as well. The idea there is, there are so many things are possible. No one should go, has to go hungry, but the social order is such that people starve. So this is like the basic tension from which how to understand the social transformation then should work, and also how it is like normatively legitimate. So when Marx says, and this is something that counts for the anti-utopianism, when Marx says it's the real movement within the existing order that, communism is not an ideal and not an utopia, but the real movement. And I think one has to understand that real movement here, reality here does not mean what is given or what actually exists already, but something that is much more let's say, normatively loaded in the sense of bearing this kind of potentials. My fifth remark is that what we have to do, I mean, while holding on to this ambivalence, I mean, the tension between utopia and anti-utopia here, what we have to give up are some of the implications. And again, this is something that is somehow even disturbing in Marcuse's text, the distinction between prehistory and history. So this is something that informs the, I mean, the whole like pathos with the idea of, I mean, that there's a distinction between reform and revolution, and I mean, some of the emotional, motivational energy that informs utopian thinking is still, I think, somehow connected with the idea that there's a prehistory and a history, and that we should leave prehistory behind. And I think this is definitely something that critical theory has abandoned, should abandon. I mean, in one sense, no one any longer thinks that there's that there will be ever a situation without contradictions. I mean, that contradictions not only somehow inform the dynamics of history, but at the same time would come to an end at some point. No one any longer believes that there will be no conflicts and so on. This is also not a very good way to understand the idea of prehistory and history. And I would say we should not only abandon it, we should also turn it around and establish the idea that it is actually history. I mean, history as we have known it, as we know it, as we are stuck in it within our capitalist social order, where nothing meaningful happens in some way, because we are confronted with a dynamic where people do not think that they can actually, I mean, change things in a meaningful way. It is then only like history in which those kinds of, I mean, those attempts to create a social order can even, I mean, come into being, who would then still be, I mean, driven by conflicts and so on. And my last remark, what I think the result of this, I mean, thinking through the ambivalence between utopia and anti-utopia will lead us to a situation that, borrowing a phrase from one of my PhD candidates, I would say we should go for a determinate utopia, maybe not concrete utopia, but determinate utopia in the lines of what I have already hinted at, determinate negation. To the thoughts related to this, I mean, determinate utopia, meaning that it should be something that works with the potentials, with what would be possible within the given order, at the same time goes beyond. And that's not necessarily, it's also concrete, but it's also determinate in terms of working with and being in relation and a strong connection to the negativity of the given social order. So in some way, I think, and this I'll finish in a minute. In some way, I think it's perfectly fine to hold on to the negativism that is also, I mean, one of the like defining elements of critical theory. And again, Jonathan Rösler has written about the connection between the utopia, between utopia and negativism. So in some way, I think, why not holding on to negativism? I mean, if we see people drowning in the Mediterranean, it doesn't take, I mean, it doesn't take so much theory, and it doesn't take, I mean, an utopia in order to know that we should help them, and that we should do everything in order to prevent them from drowning, and to fight against the social order or the European border regime that makes them drown. So this is not so, I mean, you don't need so much of a positive image about what the future society should look like in order to know that our society should not look like this. So in some way, I think the idea that it is suffering, it is things that are, I mean, unjust, and that create this kind of resentment, I mean, normative resentment. This is just something that, I mean, speaking on practical terms, we should just do. We always, I mean, some of us always do. Critical theory is engaged with this kind of social movements. On second thought, though, one realizes that it does not take a theory and not an utopian moment in order to realize what the wrong is here, but maybe you need an analysis, and this might be connected to a certain idea of utopian thinking. You need an analysis in order to figure out how they got there, why they are there, and how what kind of social arrangements, social structures, and I mean, prevents us from being able to help them. So for this, you need a theory, which brings me to my last point, that concrete utopias, as you mentioned them, and the idea that the ambivalence between utopian and anti-utopian thinking makes us think about the concrete utopian moments and the concrete, like, communities that you mentioned, and that Marcuse in his text also mentions, to have the kind of critical eye on those projects that when Marx talked about, I mean, critical theory being part of the struggles and wishes of the age, he also meant that it is part of the, like, self-reflective capacity of those movements. So I think one thing that we always have to have in mind, keep in mind, is how those communities, how those attempts to build a social order within the existing one, how they relate to the structure that they can't help them like being confronted with.
Great, thank you, Rahel. And before jumping to Martin, just I want to put a flag here in relationship to the overarching project of the seminar. Maybe particularly when you spoke about this tragedy that is occurring in the Mediterranean, which we could use perhaps later as a way to come back to some of these questions, and the tragedy of the graveyard of the Mediterranean. I suppose in that context, I think the question from this seminar would be whether there are particular initiatives and projects going on to deal with the devastation of the migration that could be highlighted in a way as forms of concrete utopias in order to give some determinateness to this notion of determinate negation and determinate utopias. In part because part of the project here is to try and show that there's a realizability to some of this that goes beyond the purely theoretical notions of negation within critical theory. And so I think that maybe when we come back, I think that would be a bit the question I would ask. But let me turn to Martin now first.
Yes, good evening or good morning, wherever you are at the moment. And let me also just take a second to welcome you in the name of the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin Institute of Advanced Study, that is hosting us, and is very happy to host this, given also their international and interdisciplinary ambitions. I can only, of course, compliment what the both of you have just said, and I would have started also with the notion of ambivalence Rahel was using, because that to me maybe seems to be the essential point. So thinking utopia with the Frankfurt School or with the critical theory authors means holding on to a certain ambivalence of the notion of the utopian or of utopia itself. And it could be that this also, since you brought this up, might pose the challenge of these texts also to the framework of 1313 utopias, because it could be that critical theory neither subscribes to being utopian nor subscribes to the critique or criticism of utopian thinking, but is as ambivalent or dialectical as you might expect. And let me just give you 3 short instances. I did the first one. Rahel had already brought it up. Of course, every later, even Western Marxist position inherits Marx and Engels' aversion against utopian thinking. When utopian thinking in the left context, that means in the context of socialist or anarchist theorizing, means anything like blueprinting the road to revolution and paradise. And in many, many little remarks and texts, they just refer to this topos. As Marxists, we have to be wary of exactly these kind of thinking, because it always means presupposing, and even sometimes falsely presupposing, that we know how to get there. So the critique of utopian thinking in terms of a critique of strong solutions or alternatives that are meant to be brought about. A skepticism towards that is part of the DNA of that tradition, and this holds for, I think, most forms of Western Marxism. But second, these were not Marxists in the orthodox sense, and one should think about the 1920s, which was the intellectual environment when the paradigm formed without having a name, and the 1930s, at the time where the paradigm critical theory, as we later called it, taking up one terminology from the mid-30s, that this already was, of course, opposing another style of Marxism, namely party communism, mainly Eastern, but also in its Western instantiations. And this particular non-orthodox, many might say, open Marxism they were practicing was, of course, insisting on the fact that not even historical materialism is providing us with blueprints to the left non-bourgeois future, but there might be something, etwas Überschießendes, something excessive in the promise that Marx and Engels had given to the history of leftist thought that is so excessive that you can't even contain it within a political program. And don't forget, the 1920s and 30s are the time when the texts of the early Marx enter the scene by new editions, discoveries of manuscripts, and all these kind of things. So these were Marxists that thought about the legacy of Marx and Marxism as a political and in itself ideological doctrine, also in the framework of the more humanistic, more history of philosophy kind of texts of Marx, where there is definitely something like a utopian element, even if the word utopia is not the one he uses. And there is the ambition, theoretical ambition, to construct something in between the alternative between bourgeois philosophy of history on the one hand and historical materialism on the other hand. So the idea that there's a leftist but not non-determinist form of thinking about history, and I'll come back to that point later. And third, and this for me is also this maybe the second DNA point. So the essential about utopia this tradition stands for, namely, and also Rahel brought it up, the negativism, or let's call it with the Adornian phrase, the Bernon images, the Bilderverbot, coming from the religious sphere, from the Jewish tradition. And this is, of course, is just a metaphor, but what it means is a theory of transformation and even of possible revolution might have the place, even the need for a figure, a cipher of ultimate alterity, of the different in itself. So another stage of history, another form of human community that is not yet realized, contained, and even thinkable within the present. So the negation that we're talking about here is the negation of what is already there, the negation of the existing, the real, the ontic. And there is the idea that a certain kind of theory that was called critical theory at one point, that Adorno himself was transforming into a form of negative dialectics, is also a thinking of this wholly other, let's call it like that, with all the theological connotations, and that utopia sometimes is a name for this, for the different in itself. And therefore, there is a critique of simple utopianisms. There is an endorsement of the quasi-utopian element within the leftist Marxist history of thought and politics. But thirdly, there's the holding on to the idea that the other that Utopia addresses is something that concerns the whole of existence, life, community, and history. And Rahel was also mentioning this from the Horkheimer text. In this sense, utopias have to be and have to refer to the totality of history or meaning. In der Ideologie geht es ums Ganze. It's about the whole, the entire form of meaning, sense, system, history. That for me is clear and hard to be moderated or negotiated against some more realistic expectations and also urgencies. And also ones I have to say that, of course, this seminar is trying to address. So it could be that this last point does not sit easy with the attempt and the urge to already find utopian moments, element, interstitial realizations. Let me just name 5 themes where I think this plays out also within this history, it is intellectual history or history of texts. The first is the important topos that utopian thinking in the Frankfurt or the critical theory style will involve an altering, a modification of our historical thinking. And the idea that older utopian thinking is suffering from a form of progressivism or a linear conception of history is extremely prominent in these early texts. So in the early text of Horkheimer on the bourgeois philosophy of history, this is prominent, and Benjamin might be the champion of this. In a way, we are trapped within a wrong conception of history when we think that utopia is this thing outside history, but could be reached by some kind of historical action. And this is something the whole history, in a way, the whole history of thought of these texts rejects. Second, for many of them, this meant focusing on the idea of discontinuity or rupture, in the sense that sometimes the utopian is a name for the break within history. And you all know, and this is maybe the most esoteric moment in this history of texts and authors, Benjamin did not shy away from the terminology of calling this, in a sense, messianic or eschatological, because this is breaking, let's say, the linear course of human history. And this also refers to the moment in the Marcuse text that Rahel was mentioning and problematizing, namely saying something like, there wasn't even history yet, and history still has to come, a Marxian thought that Benjamin and also Marcuse gives an eschatological, almost theological sense. The third point is indeed ban on images taken seriously, which is an imperative not to form utopias that I would say are determinist. I think at least the Adornian way of thinking rejects determining the content of utopia. And the ban on images means going for the excessive utopia, as excessive as it is. And you also saw that moment in the interview with Bloch, where he says, of course, the ultimate utopia is the end of death, the end of mortality, the end of finitude. And we would say, well, this is wrong because this is the wrong alternative. Adorno seems to say, thinking in a utopian register ultimately means subscribing to this excess of utopian expectation, which also we would say probably can only be addressed in theological, cosmological, ontological terms. But this might pose the challenge to other, and as I said, more moderate forms of utopian thinking, that within this tradition, there's a strong tie between the wholly other of our existence and life and systems meaning and what we could aspire to as viable or achievable. The fourth topos I would just like to mention, and this was already touched upon in the 1313 course this term, when you read, I think this was the second hour, the Accelerationist Manifesto. So in Marcuse, there is the idea that the utopian will be reached or touched or will become an object of action when we deblock, delimit technological advances. An idea that also to us, I think, sounds fully nonsensical, even dangerous. But Marcuse had that. He thought that the radical expression or the radical development of the potentialities of productive forces will bring us to points that might implode the whole system. And this might bring about something completely different. And this then might be governed or steered or regulated in liberatory, emancipatory terms. I think we don't like this idea because we in the 2020s, we think differently and we take different lessons from the history of the technology of the last 250 years. And thinking in the Anthropocene, of course, even forces us to do this, I know. But still, within this tradition, there is one utopia, namely utopia of completely delimited and facilitative productive forces, that for them was hard to be replaced by a more social, more humanistic kind of vision, at least for Marcuse. And this is also something like a pretty tough element within that tradition. I just want to mention it, and I think we all would agree this is extremely hard to actualize, even subscribe to, but it is there. And it's not only Marcuse, it's pretty, I think, always existing strand within also late Marxist thinking. The fifth point I would just like to name has to do with the end of death topos, is the idea that utopian thinking also concerns affects and transforms anthropology and what we think of man. This interests Bernard and me because we are critical theorists and Foucauldians. And we also sometimes think being a Foucauldian means putting an end to anthropology as a way of thinking, which is, I think, true for the 1960s. But at the same time as Foucault was writing these arguments, in this tradition, and this is also mainly Marcuse, sometimes Ulrich Sonnemann, Oskar Negt also was toying with this, there was the idea that you can change and should change human nature. And the ultimate utopia is a world of different human natures, different men, new human beings. This also goes back to the more futuristic, let's say, part of avant-gardism of leftist thought in the Soviet times. But there is also an interesting, very challenging, maybe even dangerous thought that you could engineer human nature, but toward the good. And the late Marcuse was extremely fearless in going there. And we might not be that fearless, I think for good reasons, but there is something. And Rahel herself has been working on the problem of the critique of needs, of Bedürfnisse. And this is a topos within the tradition that's extremely strong, that we have to combat contemporary, also libidinal structures, and the way we are, we think, we imaginize, and also the way our bodies are formed by that form of late capitalism that is in a way our context of life. And the idea is we could transform that, even intervention into the almost ontological, somatic, and psychological setup of humans. And this also, for me, is part of what the critical theory thinks about a possible utopia. And Silvia Kostova, who is one of the most important commentators of these debates, sometimes calls this the utopia of bodies or somatic utopias. And this is also definitely part of this tradition. And the Marcuse text, in a way, points to this ambition project, maybe even fantasy. And I would only like to retain as a last word, it could be that critical theory forces us to think utopianism and utopia really unbound and not even bound by realities, feasibilities, and realizabilities. It could be that the name utopia forces us to not moderate, negotiate, and in a way lower the bar, but keep it up. Thank you.
Great. Terrific. I think I want to start Martin, where with this notion of ambivalence, and also Rahel, the notion of ambivalence and the notion of negativism, which is grounding both of your interventions. I think so. This may be provocative. This may be a provocative question, a provocative point. But here's what I'd like to suggest: is the question is ambivalence kind of as a constant or as an essential element of critical theory historically limited? In other words, is there a time where one retains a historical sense that transforms the way one thinks about ambivalence and the productivity of negation? All right. So, I mean, to start this provocation, I think I would start with these passages in Bloch. So obviously, of course, Bloch is an interesting figure because he wasn't incorporated within the Frankfurt School, but was so adjacent and such a formative thinker with the Frankfurt School. The early Bloch and the later Bloch that we read in the conversation with Adorno, and the Marcuse, and the notion of the end of utopia in Marcuse. I mean, I sense there, both with Bloch throughout, regarding both the West and the East, but also with Marcuse, a greater, less ambivalence, slightly less ambivalence than elsewhere in critical theory. And having to do, I think, with, though, tied to the historical dimension remaining very important, right? And so the historical dimension remains incredibly important for Bloch and for Marcuse in their discussion, the timing, what's going on exactly in terms of the structure of society, the economics of society are central to whether they can talk about utopia. But there is nevertheless this sense that in order to affect the will, the affects, there may need to be a greater reliance on something that could be called a concrete utopia or something close to utopia without the blueprint, but something about action, something about getting people to actually act. And so the historical basis, I think, changes completely. I think today, as both of you were suggesting, we have a completely different view of the historical trajectory, the possibilities, that, as you were saying, Rahel, the impossibility of thinking of a future of non-contradiction or some ideal state in the future, and also Martin, questions of acceleration and changing relations to time and history. If we do take a different view to history, then do we come up with a different critical theory in a way, right? Are we wedded to the strong forms of ambivalence if we, as critical theorists, would have a different conception of history today? Now, and of course, it's nothing about the objective conditions and the subjective conditions, but it's something about how do we think about social transformation? Is it possible that by identifying what I'm suggesting are concrete utopias, that act of identification can actually help us to imagine different futures, right? In a way that is then less ambivalent about that, at least. Certainly not about the idea of a blueprint or anything, but about the role of instantiations as a way to imagine a future, not sketch it out, but imagine possibilities, right? And somehow I do feel in the Marcuse lecture from 67 that the whole idea of talking about an end of utopia was motivated in part by that desire. Kind of maybe when he was suggesting the end of utopia, he was trying to carve away some ambivalence. Carve away some ambivalence because the word itself is so problematic and charged. So it's like, okay, no, we're going to take this out of the domain of what we've always talked about as utopia and no longer refer to it. And you know, the first question about, you know, pop music is funny, but the response to that is interesting. It's like, well, maybe not, you know, maybe not the Beatles, right? But there are movements that have that promise, and it might have that promise. You don't know.
The students that the other guy asked him, and he says, no, I don't mean the students. Of course, he meant them.
He meant them.
Yeah.
And he said it later on.
Yeah,
right.
So he didn't get it. So yeah,
right.
Or he didn't like that student.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But could it be that identification, you know, was that an identification of a concrete utopia that in some way could serve the purpose of maybe to summarize or to brutally, crudely say it? Could it be that we do need to extract this space? Maybe the term is wrong, concrete utopias, maybe the term is wrong, but extract this space of actual praxis, promising praxis, to extract it from the ambivalence and the negation, so that we could kind of positively see what it might point to or how it might help us think the future. Okay, yes, go ahead.
I mean, two things, probably more. I think we should not, I mean, it's interesting that Martin and I both agree in somehow affirming the idea of ambivalence here. But I just want to clarify, ambivalence does not mean that one should stay somewhere in between, that one should stay like undecided, that one should be stuck into this kind of I mean, helpless, I don't know how to act and what to decide, and I mean, what to be part of and what to side, whom to side with. This is not what I mean. What I mean is, I mean, this is why I also spelled out that negativism doesn't mean that you stay in the negative, meaning pure negation and you never do something. My refugee example, or my, I mean, the tragedy of the Mediterranean and the graveyard that it has become example was actually meant to say that no matter how negativist we are, there is, I mean, the part of what are the most important issues. And I mean, what you refer to and why, I mean, you are so interested in this theory and practice thing because you think there is a like sense of, we need to have a sense of urgency, right? I mean, there's, and this is what you mean by, I mean, doesn't it change when history changes? Isn't there a sense of urgency right now that should lead you to somehow get over ambivalence, get over this position? But I don't think that ambivalence has, I mean, this kind of ambivalence has something to do with not taking part in those political movements, social movements, being reluctant to take sides, being reluctant to act. I mean, none of this is true for what we are doing, actually. I mean, as critical theorists, we try to, I mean, make space for a certain kind of conversation analysis. We try to make space for, I mean, to make things public or to give social movements some kind of publicity. We are, I mean, openly taking sides with, I mean, what, I mean, not whatever happens, but with a lot of things that are happening. And also, but this is something that is, of course, a personal matter. We are part of those, activist movements and so on, or some of us are, and reflect on, and some of our students are, and we try to make space for them to analyze what they are doing, let's say on the ground, but at the same time reflect things in the seminars and so on. So I think it's not true that there is no. It's not that that critical theorists being ambivalent with respect to Utopia would not be involved. And again, I think it's also like a personal matter and a matter of like political socialization, how close or how far away you are from like what happens on the streets. But it is an attitude that would on the other side prevent us from buying too easily in the kind of utopian thinking and concrete utopias that end up in kitsch. And I have to say
kitsch or terror.
Kitsch or terror. But I'm also I'm averse to the kind of kitsch, and I have experienced it very often that this kind of kitsch comes up within a certain certain movements who have a certain have a self-understanding of that they would kind of prefigure the world to come already and so on. So there's something that makes that should make us reluctant to just buy into it. But at the same time, of course, and you asked me for examples and for concrete examples. I would say there's of course a whole range of activities and a whole range of options. There are crises in the world that ask for resistance, and where people just have to try to to survive, but they can only do this by organizing stuff, by forming communities of resistance and so on. There are also, let's say, more positive communities who have like political projects who have this idea that they should already prefigure something, invent a new way to to work with commons, to invent new economic strategies and so on. And there's a lot of stuff in between, and I would say it depends. There's always something. Whenever you, even in a community of resistance, even if you have to organize in order to resist something that is without any doubt dangerous and bad, there will be some positive moments. It's not just being against something. There's always something, while organizing, while practicing solidarity, that also has like this glimpse of and if you're, up for utopia, we would say there's an utopian glimpse in those moments when people, engage in something and sometimes even succeed in in surviving, resisting, in being solidaristic in a meaningful way. In this kind of not asymmetrical way, but there are moments, of course, where those things are prefigured, and it's a very interesting thing that is always about, not always, but very often about occupation. Whenever you occupy spaces like Occupy, or like let's say the refugee movement in Berlin, that was very strong and that occupied a place, Oranienplatz, but then also a school, and they were living there for a couple of months and so on. And that was a huge thing in Berlin. Where people were, a lot of solidarity formed around it, but also at the same time there was this kind of self-organizing, a glimpse of what it could be like if refugees would not only be like the victims, but also the position to create some way of living together in a way that is not just like administered by the state and so on. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of things, of course, that you could then, analyze and point to. There's also, asking about what should we then do as theorists, for example, with respect to those movements. We did organize seminars where we invited people in order to, we had read like a lot of stuff on the topic, and at the same time, our students would go and talk to the people and be part of the groups, and would then bring them back into the seminar, and so on and so on. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that you can do as a theorist. What you do as a, I mean, as a let's say human being, what you do as a political activist is maybe some other thing. And I think, yes, there's always both. I mean, there are these like utopian glimpses of, I mean, like where intersubjectivity, as we critical theorists like to say, somehow gelinked, as Adorno in a very succeeds, but I mean, like comes to a certain point. The other thing is, what do I want to say? No, maybe I stop here.
Okay, so I think we agree then that, for instance, in the context of refugee migration across the Mediterranean, that it would be helpful. I think we agree then that it would be helpful then to kind of specifically identify what we would consider to be forms of praxis that are very promising in their nature. And that could then feed our theorizing, feed our critical theory in very much the way you were suggesting, bringing that into conversation so that we can help think about praxis, right? I mean, so and those are things that, you know, I'm calling concrete utopias, and we haven't done the work to explore the situation with refugees in Europe, although we will. I'll definitely do some research and
I mean,
that.
yes, of course, there are a lot of, lots of promising ways to organize. And then the question, what are you doing as a theorist? As I said, one role for you can be to make space for the kind of discussions that are necessary then. But at the same time, when I said, it is like normatively spoken, no doubt there is a crisis and one should get out of it, and one should help people to get out of it. On the other side, in order to, and this is something that even comes from, let's stay with the refugee example, those, working in those movements, when they say, we want your solidarity, not your just empathy, we want solidarity, meaning we want to be like in a symmetrical position, but also, the next step is to say, you don't even realize, meaning we don't even realize what situation we are in if we don't take the situation of the refugees into account. Next step, this says something about the nation state, something about, the global social order, something that we should analyze and reflect upon. And that's not just being part of practical movements, but this is then also a role for the theory that helps to spell out, the very crisis, the kind of contradictions that are at stake, the kind of crises that are at stake. So I'm somehow, I don't know, I somehow think there is a division of labor between theory and practice here, and at the same time one should inform the other. But you should also, and this was, I think, Adorno, who has been blamed so often for, remaining, as against Marcuse, who obviously was very much, was interested and euphoric about all kinds of movements, and also about like hippie communes and so on. And then Adorno, this kind of reluctant guy who would refrain from practice. But even Adorno had the idea, Adorno had the idea that one should inform the other. And he was very skeptical about a certain kind of being critical about theory, because there is some, for him, I think there was some anti-Semitic and anti-modernist and anti-intellectual bias to a a certain kind of criticism that students came up with. But
Mhm.
at the same time, he was thinking about this over and over. How to relate to, and he was someone who, as a public intellectual, did a lot of,
Concrete
work. He
work,
changed
yeah.
concrete work. He came up with curricula for, the kind of sociology, critical sociology that was very important for Germany, would not have existed without them. He engaged in like public, he was in public broadcasting stations every week for a while, and so on. So I would be a bit reluctant to somehow blame even the old critical theory or even the most philosophical part of it for.
I don't think I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to, in some way, kind of update maybe to different historical circumstances. But Martin,
yes, no, I see that urge, and I share the desire to do that. But I would like to insist a little bit like Rahel, maybe with a different emphasis on the non-going away of ambivalence, which you saw it for us is just a code word for dialectics. So, but it's different because it really means, as Rahel said, thinking dialectically about something does not mean you should not take sides which the thing or the situation or the problem poses. It forces you to take both sides, which means being utopian and anti-utopian at the same time, which is pretty uncomfortable. But to me, it seems like this was the position they held. And I don't mind if this doesn't really comfort us or offers us something we can immediately use. So I would still even insist on the non-usability of what the Frankfurt School does with the concept of utopia, but this means that the problem is the idea that you can use it. So it could be that the predicament they saw, and you're completely right, this is historically specific through and through. This is the thinking of 1929, 31, 36, 37. You can even give dates to the very phrases they were formulating on this, 67, 69. All of this, in a way, is saturated with historical context and, of course, also ideological contenders. So the formula, the end or the exhaustion of ideologies at that time had a very clear meaning. So this was referring to Western and Eastern ideologies. This alternative for Marcuse is exhausted because you cannot be for Western ideology because it's as crappy as the Eastern totalitarians. This is what Marcuse thought about the US at the time. I'm sorry. And this is even what Adorno thought in 41. So they were. So the Dialectics of Enlightenment, of course, is written in the growing awareness of the Nazi disaster and the crimes. But it's also written against the very country that hosted them as refugees. And you see how twisted these things can get.
The culture that they're experiencing in America.
And they thought, even so the book is written more on this than about the Holocaust. Imagine that in 1939, 41. What this means, that you even attack your host culture because you think there's a pattern there that is somewhat related to the pattern that made you flee the other continent. So, and there you see how uncomfortable a dialectical position might be. And I fear this is what they thought. And this is why Adorno at the time, when we were talking about Kral last year, why Adorno thought the student movement in general is right. This is a movement towards a better, more emancipated, liberated society. But the student movement as a political movement is as dangerous as what they try to combat. And this is also a pretty uncomfortable position. Even today, looking back on this position is kind of makes you uncomfortable for good reasons, I think. But this is what they thought. So there's something in utopias being betrayed by people who follow them, by people who formulate them. And I could imagine a line of, that's the terror.
Right.
And I could imagine a line of thought that critical theory might introduce to the 1313 reconstructing utopian thinking program that would, in a way, insist on that skepticism or pessimism. Maybe it's not the wrong word, the right word, even if it has resonances today with some other movement, because also, let's say, looking at race relations or the ecological crisis. So pessimism is the only thing that makes sense at the one hand. On the other hand, you cannot afford pessimism either. So there has to be, and this is what we think ambivalence or dialectics here might mean. You have to make way for thinking the other, thinking the alternative, thinking the utopian, without thinking that doing this will bring you any closer to this other already. And this for me is negativist in the methodological sense. And the ban on images doesn't say don't stick to the wholly other. It says do stick to it. Do want a completely different world and history and humankind, but don't think if painting it out, as Adorno famously says all the time, ausmalen, the alternative, in a way will achieve this. On the contrary, painting it out will betray the very utopian impulse. And this for me is the uneasy critical theory take on utopia. And I fully agree. This is sometimes not really in tune in what they themselves call utopia. So sometimes they speak in the more Mannheimian register. Sometimes they take up what utopia means in the 1950s and 60s more in, let's say, common also social science parlance. But this idea that you have to formulate or point to, sometimes it's more a matter of showing, of zeigen, than of saying or articulating. You have to refer to something else than the social reality and the crap we know and experience, and that's gripping us, subjecting us. But don't think that within the means of the actual existing politics and social imaginary, you can already pin down, formulate, or operationalize this other. And this is why I think the opposition to Bloch is extremely informative, because it's almost like today's situation. People like you are a neo-Blochian, a young Blochian, I would say, because you think there are these prefigurative elements of the other already that we have to, in a way, foster and cultivate and find, detect, and then maybe even appreciate and refine in theoretical terms. Whereas Adorno, and he's pretty polite in this exchange with Bloch in 64, but in the end, he thinks that this is as worse as being a nihilist or having given up all hope. And that's interesting. And when he polemicizes against the notion of hope, this is exactly what he means. So this is not the philosopher's task to see the already real or the kernels of the other, but the philosopher holds on to something that is not there yet in its notness, in its negativity.
But I mean, if we come back to, concrete examples and his worries, trying to figure out what is it actually? What are concrete utopias? One way to think about it would be this, the hippie stuff that even Marcuse talks about. Where
life forms, so alternative life forms,
like communities trying to, to live differently and so on. And the question of whether this is prefigurative already and whether this is enough or not, and how how the anti-utopianism of critical theory would apply to those. And I would say, no problem with this. This happens all the time, it exists all the time, but it should be aware of its limits. And it should be aware of the how it is connected to, let's say, of course, you can start your own business with, your own business in terms of a community-oriented, kind of self-organized business and so on, but it has, you are within a global, industry, a global market and so on. You have to reflect upon it, and people do reflect. This is something that everyone who is engaged in this kind of communities and this kind of search for economic alternatives. Everyone, is confronted with this problem all the time, and there's also a huge debate going on about, how far are we just part of the capitalist system by doing what we're doing? How can we somehow prevent us from
Right.
becoming so, and so on. So this is, this is an ongoing debate, and the critical theory, the anti-utopian, let's say, the reflective moment here is something that comes from practice, actually, and from the kind of boundaries that this kind of prefigurative practice runs into. And on the other side, trying to figure out what is concrete about concrete utopias. For example, one of the most, and now I'm talking about, of course, about concrete examples and also somehow locally bound examples. But again, we are in Berlin here. There's a huge movement about socialization of housing companies, and they even won. What is it? A public vote on expropriating a referendum on expropriating those housing companies. There is something utopian to it, but at the same time, it's very concrete. It's something that is feasible. Something that they had, of course, committees and lawyers and people trying to figure out whether it would be even be possible within the boundary of the law, and so on and so on. And it has at the same time the kind of a dimension that might lead to, the idea that public infrastructure as a whole should be socialized. The idea that not only those housing companies, but also, that one should have a different and non-commodified or less commodified take on housing and so on. This is something, in your country, even, some of the most important critical theorists in your country, when asked for practical initiatives, would say, yeah, health insurance. We need health insurance, which is something that in Germany, of course, still goes without saying. In your country, this is already socialism. And I think talking about concrete utopias, one should talk about, those concrete examples and try to figure out what are the limits. What are the limits where they run into a non-productive reformism? What are the options for doing something that a lot of people would call non-reformist reform? A kind of reform that opens up the possibility for even a more radical transformation. So I think those are the debates that one should.
Right.
But why would you not grant Bernard the term utopian or little utopian, concrete utopian, quasi-utopian here for this?
Yeah, I would say this is determinate utopian. This is something that somehow stems from the existing, let's say the existing contradictions of the and crisis of the housing market for those, not for those who invest, but for those who are in need of adequate housing, and is something that is at the same time, it's already beneath the existing structure. It's possible. It's just, it is, this is a kind of possibility that it's already there. But of course, it doesn't. One has to do something in order to make it possible, and in order to bring it into being.
So at no point would I want to get rid of critical thinking about these projects, right? That's not the idea of getting rid of ambivalence, and also at no point. And also, I think I would want to divorce the question of how to address these concrete utopias from the question of hope and pessimism. So that the idea is not to well, although I think that the distinction between kind of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, Gramsci's famous statement, and the way in which hope gets problematized in these debates, I think, is not as helpful, I think, So Adorno's resistance to the principle of hope, and hope is not a principle. I'm fine with that. But what I'm trying to focus on is whether actually these determinate utopias or concrete utopias would be that moment in your fourth point, Rahel, possibly your third point, Martin, that moment where actually if we are trying to think through the contradictions, that's the moment where we can actually focus on to understand those contradictions better and then to move forward. So that the concrete utopia becomes really important as a marker, given a different historical understanding of where we are, as a marker to then kind of ask those questions of contradiction. I don't like the term non-reformist reforms because I think it too easily solves the problem here. In other words, it too easily allows for something that seems to escape the contradictions rather than continue to think through them.
I think it opens up the question.
It might open up
it's not a solution, it is a question. I mean, how to.
We can maybe.
But I see the both of you tending to agree on many things, and there might be just a matter of terminological things, because many of the things Bernard has in mind, you would address, Rahel, in terms of either learning processes of social movements or in terms of emancipatory potential within certain contexts. And then, as always, we would say emancipation only comes when it has a self-critical and consciousness of its limits kind of dimension. But and you're right, for leftists, it's not a bad thing pointing to the progressive and the emancipatory instances in political practice. And I would also think there are many, many instances where you can do that, working pro-ecology, pro-human rights, pro-more internationalist, pro-more cooperative forms of politics and social organization is most of the times the better thing to do. And there might be even a diagnostic philosophical task of assembling these different things and saying, look, it's already there, so it's not that bad. So pessimism is not in order because there are maybe tiny, maybe marginalized, but still existing, resisting emancipatory movements. And I also think this is part of the social diagnosis or social philosophy in the critical vein should give. My point, and the both of you have no problem, and this is my main difference with the both of you, of editing, let's say, I would say diminishing, making it smaller, making it smaller, using a modified conception of the utopian or utopia for these moments. And then concepts like determinate utopia or critique utopia come up as natural, let's say, solutions, terminological solutions. What I'm trying to say is, to put it very bluntly, it could be that for the critical theory tradition, even in its historicized and actualized versions, the term utopia might be the name for something else, namely ambition. The ambition to hold on to the wholly other, or to alterity, in a strong sense. And this for me, and I used the term excessive a couple of times before, this is something excessive. This is something unrealistic and hard to moderate. But it might be what this tradition also forces us to do. And Rahel has this, you point to this moment when you say the social movements can become dangerous when they think they are the solution in what they do already. And I also see this in many, many progressive, even strongly, clearly, unambiguously emancipatory movements, when they cannot really place what they do in the right frame. And there I would say critical theory as a reflective, even melancholy science, is the one saying, well, the really different world or community would be something even more different, excessive,
Right,
alter.
right.
I mean,
right.
just to, I mean, the kind of, I mean, the new needs and the hippie communities that Marcuse talks about in this interview. I mean, it's not too provocative to say that some of it has ended up and has created Silicon Valley with new needs, new ways of, I mean, new subjects, new kinds of.
And they love utopias, by the way.
And they love utopias, yeah. So
Well,
this is
then
one
read
good
it.
reason for
Yeah.
being a bit skeptical about them. But and I mean, in order not to, and I'm not. And I mean, I always think that, I mean, everyone who has read Boltanski Chapelle would go for this kind of, okay, new spirit and so on. And I always think it is a wrong, like, this is not what we should learn from this. So it's not that emancipatory movements always end up in
Right, but it's precisely,
but it's about how to figure out at what point things go wrong and and when and why emancipatory like potentials and goals somehow, I mean, are.
But that's precisely in a way. So, and that's the kitsch, I take it, that you were mentioning. We have the kitsch and the terror now. But I think it's precisely because we also need to retain some concept and some concept of what used to formally be called utopia at a broader scale, right? So the idea of focusing on concrete or determinate utopias is not, though, it is precisely to relate them in some sense to the broader picture, right?
The broadest picture.
To the broadest picture. Yeah, to the broadest picture, which is why then in the case of Boltanski and Chapelle, there is the critical need to assess that broadest picture. I mean, the resulting, what it produces, which is forms of extreme exploitative capitalism in Silicon Valley, right? Now, the question is whether we rename that broadest perspective, which you were still calling utopia just now, right? And in that sense, I think that the critique of utopia, I mean, yes, I mean, in a way, the critique of utopia has successfully kind of kneecapped that idea of utopia, which is also reflected, I think, Rahel, in what you were suggesting about this idea that we don't have any idea of a future without contradictions, right? So, I mean, our historical perspective is very different than in the 1920s or 30s. I think that in a way, if we don't believe in the possibility of the end of history, which is the end of contradictions, which we don't believe in anymore, I don't think, then that object that we would use concrete utopias to help us think about is not an end of history, and it's not a utopia. It's the future, plain and simple, in a way.
So,
but maybe, I mean, history and the end of prehistory, I mean, one should reframe it and just say, I mean, this will not be a situation without conflicts, but maybe a situation where conflicts become more interesting and not as annoying as they are right now. So conflicts interesting conflicts about what to do, how to create a common role and so on. I mean, this is still a bit kitschy.
Although it could be that we just don't realize the conflicts that will arise.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and so our relationship as humans to animals has changed constantly over the past few decades, and creates conflicts and tensions that 20 years ago, maybe, or 30 or 40 years ago, we couldn't even have imagined, perhaps. So it could be that actually just as we can't imagine the future in a productive way, blueprint, etc., or a utopia, we also can't imagine the contradictions that will arise once we have resolved some of the ones that we are in the midst of today.
But I mean, one question, why not call what you have in mind experiments in a, pragmatist spirit?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's something that you do, you don't know what's going to happen. It's something where a certain kind of gap between what we already know,
Mm-hmm.
Between the old and the new,
Mm-hmm.
there's something working towards the new, because it's like problem-oriented, problem-solving processes, crisis-oriented. At the same time, there is this moment where you just have to figure out what to do. And there might be, a lot of different options. You don't know what's going to work out. And this is something that you can only try in the concrete by, praxis, by doing it. But it would not have this kind of, I would tend towards the idea of experiment as against utopia. And I'm not so sure. It just came to my mind while you were talking.
Experiment seems too broad. Elon Musk is doing an experiment right now with Twitter or something, right? But maybe I'd be willing to say
democratic, good, progressive experiment.
Yeah.
Whereas, and just to offer you just the alternative, and I would say, this makes sense, but this is a more Deweyan, not Adornian kind of conception, but that's fine. I think there are most of the things you want to pull out of these traditions. I would still insist, for some people, the name Utopia stands for the not being able to imagine the future.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of not being able to, the thing that you can only excessively try to imagine, wrongly, always falsely, always betrayingly. And this, for me, is the difference between also an experiment, a learning process, an experience, and the utopian in the stronger sense, with all its theological connotations. This break, this non-ability, inability, for me is intricately tied on the semantic level to the utopian element, impulse. The other thing, Bloch and Adorno called this thing fantasy. Thing that gets you a little bit closer to the good thing. It's not as alternative as a utopian vision, but that's a little bit more creative than an experiment in the technical pragmatic sense.
No, I'm not. Yeah, I see your point, but I think you are, and that's an interesting thing, that you are holding on to this eschatological dimension, and I would say this is something we can't hold on to. And I would say there's even, in Adorno you always find, Adorno, we both agree he's never wrong. You always find some Adorno quote that would somehow make your point. But there's this idea in Adorno where he refers to the miner who has a lamp in his head and tries to, this is like you make your path while walking. This is something that I'm a huge fan of. And this Adorno picture with the miner who has this lamp and who tries to figure out where to go and what kind of, and how actually reality reacts to where I'm going, what I'm doing, and so on. So there's both. There's also this kind of let's say the plated idea of
and then just by the way, when they say fantasy, fantasy in English is different. Fantasy is the imagination, so the faculty of building pictures. So it's not fantasy in the pejorative sense of a mere fantasy, but the other faculty of thinking that is not conception.
Right.
Fantasy.
And so the last thing I'll say.
But does he call the lamp the utopian? No.
The lamp. Trying to give us an idea about how to. In terms of determinate negation, and how to go on, how to find your way without already knowing the end.
Mhm.
I mean, of course, this is something that you don't need a donor for this. You just take Dewey, but
For a minor.
or mine. I mean, this idea that you don't have to have a definite goal, something that the trophy at the end of history that you aim at reaching. You can just, I mean, try.
And the light doesn't even show you the end of your path.
Yeah.
It shows you just that part of the path you will have to go through, but also leave behind. So that's an interesting anti-teleological, teleological thing.
But I mean, of course, there is as many teleological and eschatological moments.
So I think we should open it up to questions. And so the last thing I'll say is, I think from this extraordinarily productive conversation, the reason I absolutely will not give up the word utopia, as in concrete utopia, is precisely because of this resistance and the way in which the term produces the complicated space in which we are in historically in relationship to all the prior thinking about utopia, which is so important to critical theory, and to thinking about the future, and allows us then to be so careful about it, or requires us to be so careful about it. It's almost as if we did take a new turn, we would be letting go of all of the extraordinarily productive nature of the resistance to the term itself.
But we will look at it. But then you should be.
No, we're back to
You should be honest in saying this is a neo-Blochian position, and we are just insisting on the difference to the place of the notion in the critical theory register.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. All right. So we have many people who want to jump in. And so, and also I'm going to figure out who is on Zoom and would like in as well. So who wants to start? Yes, Jakob Huber. Would you mind coming close to the mic? We don't have everything set up with a separate camera, so unfortunately the audience can't see you, but Jakob, go ahead. Hopefully they can hear you very well.
Good evening. Thanks for this very fascinating and interesting discussion. I had a number of questions, but I'm just going to ask one. And I think that relates to that anti-utopian strand in political theory, which goes from Marx to Adorno, maybe with slightly different emphases. But I find it helpful that you distinguish this epistemological and this normative strand motivation, maybe. And I was just wondering whether, or to what extent, the problem really has to do with the fact that what we do when we depict the future, the utopian future, is make knowledge claims. So, you said that we can't know anything beyond the current paradigm. We kind of, in an authoritarian way, maybe impose our vision of utopia on others that also seems to relate it to a very strong, firm knowledge claim about what actually utopia consists in. So, would there be a way of kind of dialing back maybe that the strength of that claim, the way maybe the mode or the register in which we hold utopias, that might avoid some of these problems, unsurprisingly I have in mind something like hope, for instance, which seems to be a different way of relating to the idea of utopia, which if the problem actually has to do with these strong knowledge claims, maybe leave some space for visualizing or depicting these ideas of a better world without, falling into some of these traps that then seem to be motivating this kind of anti-utopian strand in critical theory.
Rahel will say yes, I will say no. To give a short answer, yeah. Isn't it?
Yeah, it's somewhere.
Should we elaborate?
Because I think your result sounded more negative than this would probably allow for. Because I think it would allow for more than determinist negativism. I think it would allow for a more positive conceptualization of that utopian vision that would go beyond even a determinist negativism.
I mean, I mean, this has something to do with the idea that, and that sounds very abstract, but I mean, in abstract terms, that it has something to do with the idea that there is no such thing as an unrelated paradigm switch. There is, and there we have something like, let's say, a logic of those paradigm switches, but at the same time, to move from one paradigm to the other has some unexpectedness, some kind of, I mean, a realm where you don't know what the next paradigm will be like. And that's just a very abstract way to say. Yes, I think I'm on your side when it comes to, and Martin would say it's a deflation of what Utopia has meant in all its ambivalence to this tradition. And I would say once we think that we have to get rid of the prehistory idea of the eschatology of it, we might end in an idea of learning processes of experiential processes that where there is a certain space for what you call hope. I probably wouldn't call it hope, because for me hope is still too much something that belongs in the church. But I know what you have in mind, and I'm somewhat sympathetic to the idea that there's something that is not kind of already spelled out, ausgemalt, a kind of utopia, but some vague sense of orientation or something that we motivationally, and this is where hope comes in, are involved without having those strong, epistemological claims. And I mean, I do get the point. I just think that maybe I would go both ways. Like, there is room for a lot of stuff that is, that goes along the negativist path. That is what I mean when I say, with respect to some of our current crisis, I don't need a positive image of how the world should look like. But at the same time, I would say, in the end, I do. In the end, there's the first step, even with respect to this, those cruel examples. In the end, not only, we need to analyze what is going on here and what is the kind of crisis that we are into, what is the kind of questions that is actually raised with the situation, even of the refugees. Meaning that even of those, whom to help is something that doesn't need so much reflection. Maybe in the next step, one has to come up with an idea of, what even Adorno would call a rationally organized society, a kind of, decently organized society, a society where, on the level of a social structure, and again, there's something that we need to analyze, and not just to, this is not only a practical matter, but also a practical matter. Yeah, at least, yeah.
Okay.
And Martin now says no.
No, I just say the notion Utopia has a different function than that.
Right. Yeah. Okay, Joel Whitebook is joining us from New York.
Oh. Hi, Joel.
Hi.
Everybody.
Hi.
I have a question for Martin. I was struck by the fact that when Rahel was referring to the kitschiness of certain alternative movements, you jumped in quickly and said that they also have a potential for terrorism. And
Terror.
Okay, terror. But the question I want to raise, or the point I want to raise, is that I would argue that in your stressing the need for the completely other, that there is also a very dangerous potential for terror there, which I think we saw, for example, in Foucault's embracing the Iranian Revolution as the totalistic negation of the West. Now, in this context, what you said about Bloch caught my attention and also made me worry, namely that for him, utopia would be the end of death. And for me, as a Freudian, this is absolutely wrong. I mean, Marcuse's End of Utopia lecture, as well his essay on liberation, came right out of Eros and Civilization. I mean, he used the vocabulary and the terminology and the categories of Eros and Civilization to articulate his utopian vision. And for him, it meant an end of repression. Utopia was an end of repression. I would say today, after developments in psychoanalysis since Marcuse's day, and especially the pre-Oedipal turn in psychoanalysis, it isn't repression that has become so much the problem for the Freudian left, but omnipotence. And I mean, as Ricoeur argues, the idea, death is the ultimate cipher of ananke, of reality, of necessity. And to think that we could overcome it is an omnipotent idea. And that our task politically is to somehow work through and come to terms with omnipotence, which means we have to become decentered in something which has strong democratic implications. So I mean, you two keep using the term ambivalence and dialectical as though they're equivalent. I'm not sure whether they're question-begging terms or not. But my dialectical idea is that what we need is utopianism of finitude, the utopia of finitude. And I think that's what Freud describes when he talks about, coming down from the heavens and forming a way of life on earth as honest, small shareholders. So I think for really radical and really democratic movement, the task is to work through omnipotence, to have a utopia of omnipotence. But here's the rub. I'm not sure how much the human animal is capable of working through its omnipotence. I think that's our bind.
Thanks so much, Joel. And I agree completely on the passages about death being, the utopia being non-death struck me as deeply problematic. But go ahead, Martin.
No, sure they are. And I also see what you're proposing, and it's very, very strong. So I could imagine a post-Freudian critique and reconstruction of utopianism. And I think this would exactly go in the direction you're proposing. And some of your work, of course, is in a way going there admirably. All I wanted to say is, interestingly enough, it's not only Bloch, but it's even also Adorno, the Adorno of the 60s. That means while writing negative dialectics and while writing the aesthetic theory, texts we think are almost Biblish in its authority, this guy says, by the way, if there is a utopia worthy of the name, this would be the abolishment of death. We could have understood if he would have said only it's the abolishment of suffering, which is something that's extremely important for him in the 50s and in his working through Kant. But he even uses that fully, completely theological or religious idea of the resurrection of the flesh or the defying of finitude. And as you said, this is outrageous. All I wanted to say, on this specific issue, this tradition has an outrageous element, which I would not trade in for more pragmatic reconceptualizations. And I would rather try to think what this might mean. And the term alterity here, of course, is also in need of explication. And since we are both Adorno followers, Joel, this is just something that provokes me and that I would not, in a way, supplant with a better idea, not even a Freudian one.
I mean, I have to say that this idea of, abolishing death, when I read it this, of course, it strikes all of us as somehow weird, right? And I would tend to, but maybe this is just my temperament, to take it as a metaphor for
what?
which is utterly unfeasible, which is, I mean,
Yeah.
in order to
Yeah,
make
yeah.
Utopia like
Right.
the most like unfeasible thing that we can think of. But
But
I
then
don't know,
John
I
will
do
say-
think
yeah.
that you're right about
But but they really did, in that conversation, they both really seemed to agree
Yeah,
on
yeah,
it in
yeah.
a way.
Yeah.
And Bloch too, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean.
And he said, "That's my idea. How did you get it?"
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And Marcuse talks about abolishing time in Eros and Civilization.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Right. Thanks, Joel. Great to see you.
that
Um,
is a scandal.
So we have Jonathan Russler here, who edited the conversation, and who I know you. So you've got a question, which so aim here, and but also help me on this neo-Blockian claim, as perhaps our resident Block expert here. Go ahead, Jonathan. Thanks.
You so much. Thank you for this really interesting discussion. I have so many notes and so many questions and things I'd like to discuss. The question I have regarding the relationship between utopia and critique, which is something that I think hasn't come up yet as such. And I think you, Professor Hauke, you've alluded to this, what Bloch calls the Vorschein, the pre-appearance of the good, or the pre-appearance of happiness and freedom and so on. And I think that this is like an interesting positive counterpart to the determinate negation, negation of the false. And these two elements seem to be in a dialectical relationship with each other, that in the sense that we need a certain concept of human dignity, for example, to indict something like the cruel border system at the Mediterranean. So the fact that this is a scandal is something that we need to have a certain notion, however vague, of dignity or freedom, to be able to criticize it. And so from this, I'd like to ask, how do we link this idea of pre-appearance of time to concrete utopia, and then how do we conceptualize concrete utopia? Is it a spatial manifestation, as in Occupy or the sans-papier movements, or is it ongoing struggles of resistance, for example, at the working place, the breaking of machines in 19th century, or is it, as I think Bloch understands it, a political strategy that's mediated with the possibilities of the productive forces, for example. So, like, for example, the socialization of energy companies with the aim of restructuring them towards ending fossil fuels.
Great, wonderful. I'll say one thing just and then pass the baton to you two. I thought that in the discussion that you edited, Bloch's and of course in his earlier work, the way in which he historicized the notion of utopia from a spatial to a temporal concept, and that was utterly brilliant. But the question that you asked actually makes me think that maybe with these changing historical moments, we need both a temporal and a spatial dimension, right? That actually maybe the temporal, so maybe it wasn't an exclusive movement in an interesting way. And of course, the occupations that you were mentioning, Rahel, are precisely on point. Most of the, I mean, it's possible that if we think of this notion of concrete utopia, determinate utopia, it will have a spatial element that is very important. Feeding, of course, if the project works, the contradictions that would make us relate to the more temporal dimensions of utopia, as you were at the end using the term. But what do you think?
All right, Margaret, this is more your problem, I would say.
I've talked too much already. No, I mean, I think it might be an interesting way to analyze different kinds of movements, the spatial and the temporal dimension. So, I mean, this is, I mean, really something that I think one should take up and thinking about what, I mean, maybe there are different categories. I don't know. I have a hard time coming up with an example for the temporal dimension.
It almost
Yeah, in terms of-
Intergenerational justice as a topic of political action in the present
Mhm.
as, let's say, a temporal, hard to master kind of form. But there is a form of prefiguration, of course, in doing things that affect not our bodies, but the bodies of our grandchildren. So there's something, and this is something quasi-utopian. Yes.
Yeah, and of course, maybe another one other concrete utopia we were exploring is degrowth, the degrowth movement, which the notions of degrowth necessarily have both a spatial dimension, but also a temporal dimension, right? Since it's automatically about a sequencing of time.
So concerning the relation between utopia and critique, we are kind of probably hesitant to sum up what Sheila Ben-Habib and Maeve Cook wrote about this in 2 minutes, but exactly, no, you're right. So this is, in the end, the critical theory question about utopia is how critique as a social and intellectual practice relates to something like the utopian dimension, and whether concrete determinant critique presupposes a grip on the utopian, and so the not yet existent. And also there, Benjamin, Adorno, Bloch, Marcuse would have different accentuations, but all of them would relate these two registers. And this is something the three of us here all hold on to, but I think in different forms. But that would be probably too complicated. But for me, this is clear. You don't act critically, and you don't even think critically if you don't have something like, not a vision, but a reference to something that is not already contained in the real existing alternatives and determinations of the present. And this is what I call the utopian. It's more or less than, or in difference maybe to utopia in the reified sense. And therefore there is a moment, a dimension of utopianism in every act of, let's say, strong, serious, fundamental critique. Yes, for sure. But do we give the whole story about these utopias? I would say no. And Sheila and Maeve would disagree on how much you can give about, let's say, the vision of the utopian. But this is probably the spectrum in this debate.
But I mean, I have to say, I'm not so sure.
Okay.
And I'll get the, I mean, where you said it's my topic. I mean, the question about critique and utopia. I personally don't feel the need for this kind of, I mean, I know it's not a personal question, but just in order to give you an insight, I think once you do, I need a positive utopia in order to criticize, in order to see what's wrong?
No, not positive.
So I'm defending this kind of, I mean, progress from instead of progressing to something. And I do think that, I mean, there's another very good quote from Benjamin when he says, I mean, those immaterial things develop, I mean, while, I mean, class struggle has all those like immaterial elements of that you then could call utopian glimpses of prefigurations or pre-appearance of the good. But this again is something that, I mean, comes up while people are doing something. And I'm not so sure. I mean, I don't know. I mean, everyone tells me that one needs this kind of motivation. One needs, I mean, as Maeve keeps on saying, one needs those at least glimpses of where we should go to. I have difficulties understanding this. And I would say, getting back to Bernard and his concern about critical theory and political practice, I would say my political practice has never been informed by a vision, I mean, an utopian vision of something. I was always a bit like I don't know, these kitschy moments of, I mean, they all look the same, like the sun is shining, kids are laughing. I mean, so whenever you look at
And there's a fruit bowl
and there's
somewhere.
a fruit bowl somewhere. So I was I mean, I would say I was always, I mean, more informed by things we should get rid of, and I mean, resistance to something than, and which doesn't mean that I haven't experienced, I mean, those prefigurative moments. I mean, very much so, but I have difficulties relating this to, I wouldn't say that without I mean, any kind of positive utopia, I wouldn't be motivated to criticize, change, engage, whatever. I don't know, but this might be a personal defect or something.
So we're at this difficult moment where questions are rolling in now, and we have a hard stop, a very hard stop.
Pretty hard.
How hard?
5-10-ish.
Okay. All right. So let's do this. Let's try and bring together a last few set of questions. Starting with Sebastian Lederle, who's here in the room with us, and then I'll read John McCready's question and Ting Huang's question. And unfortunately, that's all we'll be able to do. Go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to comment on the relationship between eschatology and totality, and on one side and the other side to theology, or because the last sentence of the Prinzip Hoffnung more or less says there's a light shining into childhood from a place no one else has ever been. This would mean home, and actually what's I think useful still of the sentence is it has an account of totality, but the theological moment is no one would ever know what it would mean if you would return to childhood and why this should be home. So I see why you think of eschatology, but from a theological perspective, I would be careful, because especially Catholic or Jewish theology, they have this, when they talk about eschatology, they mean anonetic solidarity, which would be the phrase Habermas uses, or Johann Baptist Metz would say, we must never think that we got rid of the need to remember suffering. So it's a completely different direction. Yeah. It's remembering and not future. So this would be the accent.
That's the Benjamin move, actually.
Yeah,
I mean, say that, I mean, revolutionaries are motivated by the past, not by the future.
And the other two questions, and I'll try to synthesize them, actually bring us back to these questions of, well, using the example of migrants in the Mediterranean. And I think we have addressed some of this already, but from John McCready, is it possible to arrive at normative prescriptions for action in the reflexive moment of theory and praxis as learning processes? If so, can you explain how this would happen using perhaps the migrant example, refugees example? Is this an example of what you have called determinate utopias? And question from Ting Huang, which is also drawing on the example of migrants. I wonder when progress coming from a negative understanding faces backlash in society, even in time, leads to a worse outcome. So think of Trump in the United States, which is something no one really expects or wants. Do times like this make us think that a positive view of progress is still needed? And how does that relate then to the negativist notion of utopia? Maybe we can synthesize those and provide some final reflections at the same time in response to those. Rahel, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, I mean, to the first question, I mean, I would say I didn't mean migrant situation, or I mean, the refugee situation in the Mediterranean, this was not actually my example for. It was not meant to be an example for determinate utopia. I would say the socialization movement is more like it. I mean, like the positively spoken. The
Socialization is deprivatization. Is this clear? In English?
Deprivatization.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Vergesellschaftung, deprivatization, or expropriation of the expropriators, actually. So I would say, but I mean, this was my example for maybe we don't even need any kind of utopian moment, because we know what to do in terms of going against this kind of border regime without having an utopian idea of how we should live together. But maybe this is not true. Maybe this is something where, one step after the other, asking, not only for, our immediate response, but also for the kind of analysis that I was talking about. We should understand what kind of global crisis this is part of, and then we should try to understand what kind of solidarity is needed in order to do something here. So maybe there is, maybe a determinate negation determinate utopia even comes in here with, in the context of this utterly negativist example, where the Adorno idea that we already know what the wrong is, we know very well. This is something that Adorno in his lectures on morality keeps on saying. Second question, progress. I would say exactly because we are facing those moments of regression, and exactly because regression, the term regression, that is the other side of progress, tells us more about what's going on than just than the purely normative description, of it as, wrong. Which is what actually critical theory did with respect to fascism. It was not just, it goes without saying that it's utterly wrong and cruel, but at the same time, they criticized and analyzed fascism as a moment of regression. And my idea is just that it adds something to our conceptual tools, that we have those terms at hand. So this is why I would say that, the fact that empirically spoken, we're facing a backlash does not count for, is no reason for giving up on those analytical and critical terms.
Thank you, Rahel. Martin?
Let me just say one sentence to Sebastian Lederer, because I'm really, this is extremely important what you say. So we were not speaking very precisely here. And I was referring to the messianic or messianism, then eschatology came in as a term, theology was used, religion was used. So, and these of course are vast, also even exegetical discussions. But you saw where I'm getting from. I was just trying to say this moment of alterity, ciphers of alterity, to use that horrible phrase of that sounds like from Jaspers, that this is a dimension on which I would like to hold on to, because for me this is something like the intellectual backbone of the more methodological idea of negativism, and that this is still something we could use, and the excessive was another metaphor for that. And let me just say what again, also referring to the examples, why this isn't such an intellectualist, pattern to insist on this. If you do human rights work, defending death row candidates, Bernard, or if you're really part of the migrant rights activist circles, if you work in the Mediterranean on these ships, or if you're funding them, if you're supporting them, you have to know something, that what you do is absolutely right in this one instance case struggle. But you also need a connection to something bigger, which for me would say a world in which there would be no death penalty, no borders, maybe even no capital. So we also a topic from the series of seminars, would be a world we would like to see, have experience, be part of. And not bridging the gap between this situation we are now in and where we're struggling in this one instance, this one fine chord passage, and this other world, spectrum, history, community. Not bridging that, but bearing, suffering from this distance and gap, but not become cynical and defeatist and not struggle this struggle, fight this fight. This for me means that there is something utopian, a utopian reference, even in the most minute, concrete, determinate situation and struggle and fight, but it has a halo, a context, a reference to this, as I would still say, holy other. And religion was sometimes the realm in which this was painted out, but you could give other names to this ultimate difference.
But I don't get it, actually. I mean, you said a world with no borders, no capital, no whatever. I mean, this is negativism. I mean, this is like no border, but not imagining how the world would look like then. And exactly. I mean, even I would go much further. I mean, imagining a world with no capital. I mean, I would say, of course, there are ways to spell out how one could, I mean, how this society is organized, I mean, economically in a not only unjust, but also irrational way. And one can, I mean, it's not so, in most cases, it's not so difficult to imagine how this could be better. I mean, so this is interesting that you would say we should hold on to, I mean, the like holy other.
Yeah, to the gap.
And the totally other, but at the same time defining it in this negativist way without even bridge, I mean, trying to bridge the gap. So that is an interesting move.
For me, the utopian element in critical theory is, in a way, exactly that, not bridging that gap with utopian theories, little utopianisms, but insisting on this difference. Yeah.
Well, excellent.
So we had this agreement in the end.
Excellent. Yes, indeed. Although we won't call them little utopias, we'll call them concrete utopias. With, though, somehow, maybe if there is disagreement there, the only thing is I would want to actually somehow embrace both positions of concrete or determinate utopias with some unbridgeable, perhaps, negative utopia. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to have to stop here because of time. But I want to thank you so much, Rahel and Martin, for joining us at this Utopia. And thank you all for coming out. It's been absolutely splendid. And I hope that we will actually continue the conversation because I think that maybe putting one's finger on this problematic term, utopia, is extremely productive. So thank you so much, Rahel. Thank you, Martin. Thank you
so
to the
audience. Thank you
for hosting us in Berlin. Next week on Friday, we'll be in Paris at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales with Laetitia Ries and Etienne Balibar to discuss Laetitia's extraordinary paper, Utopie le présent, le rêve historique des utopies. That's on Friday, March 17th, up at the Campus Condorcet in Paris. And then on this theme, we'll be with Shayla Ben-Habib to discuss critique and utopia. And that will be on April 12th, actually. And we'll be joined by Shayla Ben-Habib, as well as Bob Gooding-Williams, Karuna Mantena, and Kendall Thomas back at Columbia. So thank you all, and thank you. And thanks to the Wiki.